Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Joti Brar. Joti is the chair of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. Joti, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you so much for having me.
Maybe I'd start with the special military operation, Russian special military operation in Ukraine, given that divided a lot of people on the left. And I've realized you have been involved in that debate, in that kind of reorganization, in that argument. If you could spell out what the sections of the left miss out on when they don't see this as a special military operation and instead see this as a Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Thanks, Jyotish. Excellent question. And really, the launch of the SMO revealed to us a deep split in what was calling itself the International Communist Movement and a real lack of theoretical grounding of many organizations that call themselves Marxist-Leninist. Essentially, they allowed themselves to be swept along with bourgeois propaganda, which every Leninist should know how to see through and withstand these. Our life is punctuated, isn't it, by hysterical overloads of bourgeois propaganda. And you know, when everybody is screaming at you one message, the ruling class wants you to think something, and it wants you to have an emotional reaction to a whole load of assertions they're making. It wants you to not use, the programming, the sensible thinking part of your brain. It wants you to be swept along in emotion. And it creates this kind of wall of hysteria that's supposed to stop people having sensible conversations. But obviously, the job of communists, because we study Marxism, is to apply our understanding to the situation and come up with an analysis of what's really going on. And the first thing to ask yourself about any war is, what's the context? What's the background? What were the policies that were being pursued by both sides before this war broke out? And as soon as you look into the context of the SMO, you have to admit a whole raft of things that the Western propaganda has completely wiped out. In fact, the whole of the West's narrative management starts from the day the Russians launched the SMO. And everything that preceded that is wiped out. So the fact that there have been 2 coups in Ukraine to replace governments that tried to be more neutral in their positioning between Europe and Russia, that's not talked about at all. The fact that, in fact, we had, since 2014, there was a fascist junta in Kiev, which was controlled by the CIA and MI6, that's obviously not talked about. The fact that since 2014, this fascist junta with its MI6 and CIA handlers had been overseeing pogroms against Russophone Ukrainians who were, almost half the population, right? It's a huge section of the population, but which of course has naturally friendly feelings towards its Soviet history and towards its Russian neighbors. That's wiped out. The fact that, in fact, it was not the Russians who started this war. The war started in 2014 when sections of Ukraine refused to accept the fascist coup that had taken place through the Maidan process, right? So all of that is wiped out. Actually, what you had in the Donbass was an anti-fascist war of resistance against what was essentially a colonial project. Ukraine already lost its sovereignty to the West in 2014. In fact, there'd been a process of undermining Ukraine's sovereignty really since 1991. You could say in many ways Ukraine lost its sovereignty then because the Ukrainian people voted to stay in the Soviet Union. But their will was overturned. The Soviet Union was dissolved. They didn't want to lose socialism. They didn't want to lose the USSR. They voted that way. They were ignored. So there's been a process of eroding Ukraine's sovereignty ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the counter-revolution that took place in 1991. But very much, 2004 with the so-called Orange Revolution, that was the first attempt to install a West-backed dictatorship, didn't quite succeed. They came back in 2014, but in the meantime, they'd been funding fascists. In fact, if you look at the history of Ukraine, again, something that's not talked about in the West, funding of Ukrainian ultranationalists who then became fascist since, the 1930s onwards by Western imperialist powers has been ceaseless, non-stop funding of Ukrainian fascists. Why? There has always been a desire by the Western imperialist powers to use Ukraine as a launch pad and as a battering ram to try to destroy Russia. Russia and the destruction of an independent Russia, the destruction of the Soviet Union for a certain period, but before that Russia, and after that Russia again, that has been a long-term goal of the imperialist powers. So we've seen a continuation of imperialist policy throughout this whole period since 1991. In 2014, they got their way. They got a regime that they were completely in control of. All sovereignty lost to the Ukrainian people. All opposition cracked down on. Trade unions banned. Political parties banned. Media outlets banned. Independent activity of the working classes basically banned. Terror gangs roaming the streets to discipline the workers. Fascism out in the open again, the whole history of Ukraine totally rewritten, history of World War II totally rewritten, fascism from World War II period whitewashed, the people who carried out and assisted enthusiastically in carrying out the Nazi Holocaust in Ukraine and Poland during the 30s and 40s, completely whitewashed, and those people rehabilitated not only in Ukraine but across Western and global media, whitewashed, and these people, these terrible war criminals held up as, the fathers of the nation. And we see our own politicians in the West saying the slogan of these fascists, Slava Ukraini, is the slogan of the Banderite fascists who carried out massacres of Jews, communists, Slavs, Poles, during the World War II Holocaust period, and who carried on fighting against the Soviet Union after the war was officially over for another, 8 years? There was an ongoing West-backed kind of resistance war, so a terrorist campaign essentially in Poland and in Ukraine that went on all the way up to 1953 with the funding from the West of fascist remnants who they kept in Ukraine. And when they were defeated, as many of them as possible, they airlifted out and they looked after them in the hopes that one day they'd have the opportunity to make use of them again. And so we saw in Canada, in Australia, in the USA, in Britain, there were communities of essentially rescued fascist Ukrainians who were paid, funded to bring up their children with their traditions. Right? That's the nice word for, keeping fascism alive in their mentality and their customs, right? They were funded. They had these little Ukrainian cultural centers that got state funding to keep all of that alive, to keep their community feeling alive, their culture of fascist supremacism alive. And the imperialists are good at this. They like to keep their proxies on the ice, just in case they get an opportunity to use them again. They did get an opportunity, sad to say. The Soviet Union was overthrown, it dissolved, and in country after country, fascist proxies who'd been kept on ice were parachuted back in. And the propaganda moguls from the West started their job of rewriting the history and the history books, setting up museums, NGOs to create a new cultural memory, changing the syllabus in the schools, so that new generations of kids growing up in Ukraine are taught a complete reversed picture of their own history, and therefore are being propagandized to become Russophobic. That's the whole aim, is to turn not just the territory and the resources of Ukraine, but its people into a willing proxy force to be able to be hurled at Russia. And now we see the result. We see the result that the men of Ukraine, have been either exterminated or have had to leave the country in order not to be exterminated, all in the cause of the imperialists' goal of destroying Russia. They want to repeat, there's a huge, we have to recognize also the big picture is we have this massive global capitalist crisis of overproduction. Last time it got to a really bad situation for the global economy. Actually, the post-war boom came to an end of the 60s, and the overproduction crisis was deepening again. Through the 70s and 80s, there was a whole load of civil unrest. There were unemployment. There was closing down of industry. There was big problems in the economies across the capitalist world, and essentially the imperialists rescued their system and restabilized themselves and brought back profitability by looting the resources of the Soviet Union and the former Eastern European socialist countries. So they gave their system a huge shot in the arm. But it's important to notice that while they were doing that, while they were in clover and making so much money by looting the huge wealth that had been built up by the socialist countries, they also took the opportunity to accelerate and deepen their attacks on their own working classes. So they weren't saying, oh, well, now that finances are better, we can carry on with the nice distribution of wealth we had after World War II. No, now that the threat of the Soviet example was gone, they no longer saw the need to keep bribing off the whole of the working class with the welfare reforms that the whole imperialist world had to put in place after World War II in order to stem the tide of revolution, which was spreading fast around the world. So even good times for the imperialists don't result in good times for the working class. The only thing that gets good times for the working class is the threat of revolution. And really, for me, the lesson to be learned from that is we've got to stop just threatening and go all the way and, finish the job. But coming back to your question about, coming back to your question about how the communist movement failed in this moment. So what you saw was a whole bunch of communist parties who have essentially allowed themselves to become so rotten with revisionism, so demoralized by the victories of capitalism, that they have essentially become amplifiers of bourgeois propaganda. They've accepted the bourgeois narrative and they've stopped studying. They've stopped analyzing in a Marxist-Leninist way the real class forces at work. And they've stopped really having any faith in the ability of the working masses to make a revolution. So they no longer see their job as helping the working class make sense of what's going on, helping the working class understand why capitalism has to be replaced with socialism. Instead, they see themselves as a kind of permanent oppositional force that just kind of wrings its hands and says, oh, things aren't very fair, are they? But essentially who buy into the kind of petty bourgeois critique of capitalism, which is it's not fair and we should fix the unfairness, rather than the Marxist understanding, which shows us why it is that the problems that are built into the capitalist system of production for profit cannot be resolved within that system. And therefore, the job of a communist party is to help the working masses organize to remove the capitalist system of production and replace it. And what you see is the parties that are unable to recognize that Russia is not an imperialist country and Russia did not start this war. Russia is the target of the entire imperialist camp because it is sovereign. And its sovereignty essentially makes it, whatever the wishes of its leadership and whatever the financial system that they are overseeing, they are objectively a bulwark of anti-imperialism in the world. And given that the main contradiction on the planet is between the imperialist bloc and the oppressed masses, we have to, as revolutionaries, we have to be on the side of the anti-imperialists. It is our job to call for the victory of Russia, not to say, oh, they invaded, like kind of pacifist cretins. It's obviously nonsense if you understand what's been happening. 8 years of war was inflicted by NATO through the Kiev junta on Russophones who just tried to resist a fascist coup in their country. It was actually, Russia was very slow to come to the defense of the Donbass, but it realized in the end, what did I'm not sure if it was Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov, but one of them pointed out, after extended experience of trying to come to agreements with the Western powers, that these people are agreement incapable. They only understand one language, and if we want to defend our sovereignty, we are going to have to do it through facts on the ground and through force, because it doesn't matter how many treaties you sign, we will abide by our side and they will undermine it from their side. So, the anti-imperialist world has been learning these lessons that unfortunately a lot of people calling themselves socialist and communist have not.
If I could add one point to your earlier point about that stagflation of the 70s. I mean, eventually in the 70s, it becomes a stagflation, but the falling rate of profit started even in the 60s in the developed parts because of over competition, and the periphery was not able to buy these products because the purchasing power was so limited. That was resolved, as you said, by looting up the countries behind the Iron Curtains and Soviet Union. But I would also add by looting a lot of the global South that was not socialist, or let's say not communist, so to speak, but by imposing this neoliberal project on large parts of Asia, Africa to extract surplus labor. That's how it allowed to resolve the crisis of overproduction for a while. If I could play a devil's advocate here, there are sections of the left who are very categorical, very clear in their minds that Russia's response is something that is a response. Russia has responded to what it has been provoked. They are very clear about that. But I guess there is a division even within those who accept that this is a provoked response. But there are some within that camp who would say that ultimately maybe Russia shouldn't have invaded. Yes, they're provoked. We should blame the West. We should blame NATO, etc., etc., etc. And they spend a lot of time in critiquing, as we do. But ultimately, they say that maybe Russia had other means than invading, and they still call it an invasion. And I'm thinking about not necessarily all leftists, but even Scott Horton, a libertarian who has written the book Provoked. He documents, it's a huge book. He documents the whole history of this conflict. But then he has a chapter where he lays out possibility that Russia could have done instead of this special military operation. I also interviewed Claire Daly, and she's very vocal. But if I'm not mistaken, and correct me, viewers, if I have misrepresented her, I think she also said that Russia shouldn't have invaded, or it's wrong. I wonder what you would say to that line of analysis.
I think fundamentally it's a response to the fact that these people are living inside the overwhelming hysterical media bubble, and it's very, very hard to stand firm on the correct position when everybody around you is like, how can you possibly say that? They're lunatics, they're maniacs. So they say, no, they were provoked, but okay, it wasn't a good idea. And it's a kind of a nod also to a kind of bourgeois pacifism that refuses to understand what imperialism is. The Russians were very, 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 very slow to act. They acted very carefully and very properly. You'll see that Vladimir Putin is a president who cares very much about international law as well as national law, of making sure that you have everything in place to be able to show your own people, the international community, your allies, and your critics, no, look, we've followed the correct procedures at every step of the way. I think people have to understand properly. It's not just, Russia wasn't just provoked. If you look at what was going on in Ukraine from 2014 and look at the course of the war since the SMO developed, what you'll see was NATO. Okay, there was all this toing and froing about whether or not Ukraine could ever be in NATO, but de facto, it already was. Ukrainian army was built up by NATO to be NATO's biggest army. That was happening. Now, no one was threatening Ukraine. So why were they doing that? There was only one reason. It was preparations for war on Russia. They built huge fortifications. They turned the east of Ukraine into a massive fortress, ready for a war on that territory. And finally, well, not finally, actually, there was supposed to be a peace process, right? The Minsk process that Russia signed up to as a guarantor. So did France, so did the USA, so did Germany, I want to say. They were all supposed to be guarantors of a peace process that everybody had agreed to. What happened? Russia abided by it. Everybody else ignored it and undermined it. And after the SMO was launched, they all even came out in public and said, oh yeah, we never meant it. We were just buying time to keep making facts on the ground, to make the Ukrainian armed forces bigger. What was the purpose of all of this? They wanted to find a way to launch the kind of war that they thought was what brought down the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. We won't have that conversation now, but they're wrong. That wasn't what brought down the Soviet Union, right? But they wanted to launch the kind of war that they thought would bleed Russia and undermine the Russian economy and Russian social cohesion and force a regime change in Moscow so that they could come, dancing in and have another looting orgy like they had back in the 90s, right? That was their plan. Just before the SMO was launched, we started to get, it was only sort of became clear what had been happening properly afterwards, because at the time it was very hard to make sense of it. We started to get a lot of overwhelming propaganda that Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade, and it all seemed, for people who didn't know all the details on the ground, like, why are they suddenly screaming like that? What it turns out is the Western forces, the NATO-backed Ukrainian forces, were massing on the borders of Donbass for a big invasion operation to try to retake the territory. And basically, that was the moment at which Russia stepped in to stop that. So even at that point, for the West, the way they wage their wars is they need to have narrative control. So they try to always make it look as if the other side started it. I don't know if you noticed back in December, January time in South Korea, there were a whole load of, all through October, November, December, January, there were a whole load of provocations which were actually aimed at tripwiring the DPRK into an invasion of the South, which they're ready to do at any moment if they need to. But the USA wanted to restart that war front, but they only want it to restart if they can present it to the world that the other side started it. So they did a whole load of provocations. They were flying drones over Pyongyang. One of the things they did, they tried to set up an assassination of a politician. And I can't remember all the details of the names and the parties and everything, but essentially it didn't work out. But they had North Korean army uniforms that they were preparing to leave at the site to make it look like some North Korean soldiers came over and assassinated this politician. Right, and it was supposed to bring the South together in a anti-DPRK moment and trigger the outbreak of the war, but with a narrative that says the North started it. Well, essentially, it was the moves of the NATO forces to launch a big invasion of Donbass that triggered the Russian special military operation to stop that in its tracks. So it was presented to us that one day Vladimir Putin woke up and was a genocidal maniac and decided he needed to crush his neighbors and just rolled his tanks in, and it all came out of the blue, didn't it? And that's the narrative that's been thrown at people in the West so hard. And I think even the people who have resisted that narrative, because they're so surrounded by people who are propagandized and hysterical, I think they find themselves softening at the edges. And a big part of that, in my view, is not having a kind of Marxist base from which to draw your strength when everybody around you has gone hysterical and following the propaganda.
One last question here. Maybe as Marxist, I would ask you to help me look at the impact of the Russia's special military operation through the lens of class struggle. How does it look like? You have said elsewhere that the special military operation opens up revolutionary possibilities. It's easier for me to understand that through the analytical framework of anti-imperialism, because this is like after many, many years, maybe since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has said that to the Western military empire that it's enough. We are not going to tolerate your bully. And this is also the time when China is asserting itself against the imperial bully at its backyard, and all, not just the retaliation through the tariff wars, but also its own military demonstrations through parades and so on. So to that extent, it's very clear that the West has been pushed back, and now some of the documents that the National Security Defense document that has been presented to Pete Hegseth, written by Elbridge Colby, suggests that the United States is considering to retract its military focus from China and Russia towards Latin America. Now, we would have to see how much of that would be implemented and how that goes. But there is one signal, at least, that they have understood that Russia and China have been asserting now, and it's not going to be a cakewalk to keep doing what they have been doing. But help me understand it through the class lens. How does it look from the working class? I mean, Russia is not a communist country. I can think about the implication for the working class in in Eastern Ukraine, Donbas, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, that it would be very positive, obviously. But beyond that, what realignment of class forces does this special military operation does, if at all? And this is not to say that pushing back against the military empire is not revolutionary in itself, but I'm just trying to understand if there is a direct class layer beyond that.
There absolutely is. It's not a nice and clear and simple one as everybody would like it to be, I think, sometimes. But fundamentally, the enemy of the anti-imperialist camp and all the oppressed nations is the same enemy as the workers in the imperialist countries. And this is what the communist parties should be telling their working classes all the time, right? Our allies, if you live in an imperialist country, your allies are not the petty bourgeois kind of fake left who want to reform and fix the system and who are fundamentally bought off and loyal to the system. Our allies are in the oppressed world and the anti-imperialist world. And we need to be building one big united camp, because yes, I said the SMO really has marked the opening of a new era. It's, on the one hand, it's a new moment in the development of the overproduction crisis, which is really reaching extreme proportions. The economic troubles of the imperialists are deepening by the day. And you must recognize this is the driving force for their war drive, is their economic desperation. They need this looting. They need this orgy of destruction and reconstruction to rebalance the system and try to regain profitability, because otherwise they're in very, very, very deep trouble. The economics system is teetering on the brink of a humongous meltdown. I think there's a lot of quiet bailing out of institutions going on behind the scenes just through money printing. But of course, that brings with it all kinds of problems itself, which are slowly building up social and economic problems locally and globally through inflation and through lack of confidence in the dollar and the euro and the pound and all of that, which the imperialist countries have relied on and forced down everybody's throats for so long. But at the same time as the imperialist camp is in such a crisis, the anti-imperialist camp, as you said earlier, it's refinding its feet. It's finding its feet actually in a way we haven't seen since the death of Stalin, coming together with common recognition of a common struggle, despite the fact that all the members of the camp are not socialists, right? You've got China, you've got the DPRK, you've got Vietnam and Laos, but you've also got Russia, you've got Brazil, you've got, of course, we've got Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Yemen, Iran. There's a variety of types of economy and society in that camp. But what characterizes them all is a recognition that they will never be sovereign. They will never be able to develop their own economies independently. They'll never be able to control their own resources and deliver anything for their populations while imperialism is there threatening them. And one by one, they can be picked off. Increasingly, there's a recognition that the fight has to be fought in a unified, coordinated way. So you are starting to see the revival, actually, of an international order that began with the October Revolution, where the socialist country was the bedrock of that, the socialist USSR. But the socialist USSR recognized, again, that imperialism is the big enemy in the world, and it made fraternal ties with all kinds of nations that just wanted to be sovereign and independent. They weren't necessarily all going socialist tomorrow, right? If you read Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, which was written in 1924, he points out that the emir of Afghanistan, who is obviously a feudal ruler, was objectively on the side of the revolutionary forces in the world because he was standing up for a sovereign and independent Afghanistan, whereas there were bourgeois forces in Egypt, although he was saying the bourgeois forces in Egypt were also more objectively revolutionary than the Labour Party aligned forces in Britain, which actually were there to enforce for the empire, although they called themselves working class and socialist, right? So we have to look at what's objectively the content of somebody's struggle and not just the words they use to wrap it up in. The Yemeni fighters are constantly quoting from the Quran when they objectively get together with people from across all kinds of religious and political spectrums to have a united front against Zionism, and they recognize that Zionism is a tool of imperialism. They recognize ultimately their struggle is an anti-imperialist struggle. So, this coming together is something which is hugely significant, very, very important. It offers the possibility that this drive into World War III doesn't have to end in either nuclear obliteration, which is a thing that we've all been blackmailed into to be terrified about. It also doesn't have to end with the ruling classes of the West getting their way and reasserting their dominance. It can actually end in their defeat. But what we have to recognize as workers, in the imperialist countries, is that the job of vanquishing imperialism cannot be left to the forces of the anti-imperialist world elsewhere. They may militarily defeat it. They may earn for themselves a respite. But while the financiers in Britain, in Germany, in France, and in America are still sitting on huge, huge mountains of finance capital, they will never leave alone territories which have got free. They will continue to pay for armies and media and all kinds of provocations and dirty operations to make trouble and undermine those countries' ability to progress and develop while they're allowed to do it. It's the job of the workers in the imperialist countries to stop them. And we also have to recognize that, the days of the post-war bribes, essentially, the social contract that was made where we agreed not to make a revolution in return for being given some of the things we would have got if we had made a revolution, those things are all being taken away. They're not coming back. We're not getting back to 1945. That was a product of a revolutionary situation. The only way that things are going to get better for British workers is the same way they get better for workers, in other parts of the world. It's when the imperialists are stopped from being imperialists, and that means they've got to be dispossessed of their stores of finance capital. They've got to be separated from their ability to control economic and political life. And so this is a two-front struggle. The opportunities for that struggle are opening up. People's life conditions is teaching them a lesson that no reading of Lenin could have taught them, which is what the system really is, what the ruling class really thinks of you, right? If we watch the way our ruling class has thrown Ukrainians into the meat grinder in the most reckless fashion, and what we see now is so much of that was directed by British operatives. There's a lot of evidence now that says they're the mastermind behind the worst and most bloody operations in this war. What we see is a continuity of attitude towards ordinary working people, whether at home or abroad, from 1914. I don't know if you may not be so aware of it, but it's still something that was very strongly in the folk memory when I was growing up in Britain, of how the generals in World War I treated the ordinary soldiers as so much disposable cannon fodder. That's actually where we get that expression from, I believe. certainly it's where it came to my mind from, in my education, was that attitude, that total supremacist, they're just disposable, and the horrible stories we grew up with about, wave after wave of human bodies being sent into machine gun fire to be mown down, as a fight went over this hill or that hill. We go forward 2 meters and we lost 300,000 men. Fundamentally, that war wasn't about those scraps of land. It was about who gets looting rights on the colonies. Right? That wasn't made clear either to us in our history books or to the people who were fighting it. But in that war, the working people of Europe were treated as entirely disposable cannon fodder. And the reason that our rulers can treat us that way is they don't consider us to be real human beings. They don't consider the oppressed to be, in the colonial countries, to be real human beings. You see that exact same attitude, the way that they've treated Ukrainian men. They do this bleeding heart media to try to make, nice people in the West feel that they must be on the side of Ukraine because they're told all sorts of horrible stories. But it's all absolute crocodile tears. All of the tragic and horrific things, the crime that's been inflicted on the Ukrainian people has come from these Machiavellian, imperialist financiers who treat the whole world the way the East India Company treated India, as just an opportunity for corporate looting, essentially.
Yeah, you are right. I'm not old enough to have heard those folk memories, but I have read a couple of books on this subject. I mean, there are now increasingly more books written on India's participation in the what is called as the Great War at that time, and not just combatants. I mean, the combatant participation was massive, more than 1 million people, but I think more than 500,000 non-combatants participated with the combatants, and there are many books now written on the lived experience of Indian soldiers. And I'm assuming you have roots from Punjab, but yeah, so Punjab was the canal colony, and there was the recruiting ground, and there were both Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs. They went to France and Flanders, and what they saw was it was a very difficult time for them to cope up with racism, wars, etc. But I think even more difficult was the Muslims who were sent to Mesopotamia, because at that time the British Empire was claiming it to be the Muslim empire, because their claim was that more number of Muslims live under our empire than the Ottoman Empire, because they were competing with the Ottomans. And the Muslims who went to Mesopotamia and were seeing all the blasts and ammunitions, they were very divided, because they had heard about the land of Harun al-Rashid, and these were their holy lands, but people are just being killed now, and so there are books written on that. All right, you spoke about the responsibility of the working class in the imperial core, and that brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you about. At least from your party's perspective, in an imperial core, having a party which wants to convince the working class about the struggle against capitalism, about the struggle against empire, at a time when a lot of working people are bought into the parliamentary electoral form of politics. I mean, politics for a lot of people, over and above all, is election, although I don't want to overemphasize that as well, because that's not necessarily true for everyone. And we are grappling probably with this not just in the imperial core. We are also thinking about other liberal democracy, liberal quote unquote, like India, where the whole role of the communist parties are being debated and discussed, because in India there are parts like Kerala, for instance, where the communist parties can actually fight elections, and so far they have been winning. But over and above, I think, largely speaking, the communist movement in India remains very strong. I mean, that's my reading of it. I don't know how you read it, but when I go to the farmers' demonstrations, the farmers' marches, any kind of trade union mobilizations, these are largely under any one or other form of umbrella organizations of the Communist Party. So outside the electoral politics, of course, massive presence of the communist parties in India. I'm not sure about Britain. You would enlighten me about that. I don't think that's true. As a communist party, as someone associated with the communist movement, in that imperial core where politics is so often thought and imagined through election, even the left would be obsessed with a Corbynite party or dissident labor. And what would be your strategy, or what's your agenda or framework to convince the working class about the struggle that they ought to fight?
Fundamentally, our job is to help the working people learn from their own experience. So show them what it is life is teaching them to kind of accelerate the learning process, if you like. It's not our job, if you like, to convince the workers that they need to make a revolution. A revolutionary situation will arise. It's our job to help enough workers understand that there is no way to fix this system to deliver the things that they need. And really that means popularizing a Marxist understanding. So our job is, first of all, to train Marxists, and then for our Marxists to go amongst the people and be connected with them, be part of them, and popularize a class conscious understanding of what this society is, how it works, why it can't and doesn't deliver for them, why their lives are getting so much harder, and all of those things. When it comes to the obsession with electoralism, you're right, it's been totally dominant in the post-war period, but that is actually, it's changing fast. Since the, as you said, kind of neoliberal agenda was coming back through the 80s, 90s, working people's experience in Britain was very much that, oh, look, we're under attack and nobody's defending us. And we've been told that Labour Party is the party of the working class, and we've been voting for them religiously for generations. And we have a Labour council and a Labour MP, and they haven't even shifted themselves to save a library book in a library, never mind a job or a factory or an industry, right? So, in fact, working people in Britain who have seen, the increased, accelerated pace of deindustrialization of Britain, which, of course, let's not forget, began actually at the end of the 19th century, because this is the inevitable development of capitalism as it becomes monopoly, and Britain is, in fact, the most advanced in this respect. We have the least productive industry left in our country that was once the workshop of the world, right? We make almost nothing. Our entire economy has essentially become parasitic. A parasitic body on the global economy is basically what the British economy has become, rather than there being pockets of parasitism that were identified by Lenin. That pocket's now extended to almost the entire country. There's so little that we make here now. Parliamentarism is losing its hold on the minds of the mass of Britain's poorer workers. Let's give you an example. In the last election, where the Tories have been in power for, 13 years or something, and they were thoroughly discredited and hated by everybody because obviously life's been getting worse, and they've been at the front of the government while that's been happening, and they've been fronting up for massive austerity drives since 2008. And overseeing, the implementation of a far harsher regime for workers in terms of casualisation, and precarity of work. Right, so people on 0 hours contracts, not proper working conditions, no pay, no holidays, no sick pay, no pensions, so people's working lives have got much harder. They're working either longer hours or not enough hours, and either way, they don't make enough to make a living. A lot of people in work are on benefits. A lot of people in work are using food banks. A lot of people in work are homeless. So we have this huge developing crisis, a poverty crisis, a hunger crisis, a homeless crisis, a work crisis. And the trade unions and the Labour Party leadership have completely facilitated all of this taking place over the decades. So working people have really lost faith in the two-party system, or in the idea that Labour Party is a real alternative, despite the fact that there's a huge machinery just on the outside of the Labour Party of people calling themselves socialist and communist, but who are revisionist communists and Trotskyite socialists, who basically work to catch people sort of who are falling out of the Labour fold and kind of herd them back in and say, no, but we've just got to get rid of the Tories and then everything's going to be better. So they were working very hard at the last election, telling everybody, no, we've just got to get rid of the Tories and then everything will be better. Despite this, in fact, the turnout for that election was really, really low. And if you don't just look at the electoral roll, but at the over 18 population, and there's an increasing disparity between those two numbers now in Britain. There's a lot of people who aren't even on the electoral roll because on the one hand, it puts you in the firing line for taxes if you're on the electoral roll. And on the other hand, there's people who are like, well, I'm not bothered. It doesn't make any difference who you vote for. So the electoral roll is not everybody who's eligible to vote. But if you look at the population of adults over 18s in the UK, you'll find that about half of them actually didn't vote at the general election. And only 18% of them, 1/8, voted Labour. And because of the way the system is set up, the ruling class was able to manage that so that they got Labour a supermajority in Parliament and they could trumpet it as this massive landslide. But actually only 18% of adults in the UK voted Labour for them to be able to get that. So there's actually quite a crisis of legitimacy for British politicians and for British parliamentarism. And you can see at the moment that Labour has become even more toxic since then because of what they've been doing in terms of austerity at home and because of what they've been doing in terms of war crimes abroad, in particular facilitation of and cooperation and participation in the genocidal assault on Gaza. And simultaneously, alongside that, the crackdown on free speech and protest at home. So all of these things have made Labour super, super toxic. There's almost no chance they could get re-elected at the next election. The ruling class strives for a stable majority in Parliament because if there's a party with a majority, they can, get their laws through with relatively little upset. It's very difficult when there's a bit of a hung Parliament and there's negotiations all the time to get legislation passed through. So they prefer a stable majority party to be in government. We see right now that forces are being set up where essentially I think what's happening is you're getting the left wing of the Labour Party is being reconstituted outside the Labour Party, but its job remains the same thing, right? So that's the your party kind of thing. And then we have the right wing of the Tory party being reconstituted on the outside of the Tory party, and that's reform. And these two are being held up to people in the hope that they can be brought back into the electoral fold, the wishing and hoping that things are going to get better through voting if only you have the right person in charge and it's a new party and this is all fixed. But we've actually seen this story before. In Britain, we've not seen so much of it, but across Europe, we've seen the collapse of the main social democratic post-war parties and their replacement by new organizations or their supplementation by new further left organizations. And every single time they come to the brink of doing something that looks like it might really get up the nose of imperialism or upset the ruling class's agenda, they knuckle under and end up propping up the very forces that they're supposed to have been brought in to oppose. So we saw it with the new anti-fascist front, or whatever they called themselves, in France, didn't we? Not so long ago, they ended up supporting the very establishment that they were promising their followers that they were going to be an alternative to. We saw it with Syriza in Greece. They went right to the brink, didn't they, of saying no. So because PASOK, the Social Democratic Party PASOK, collapsed, there was this drive by the European Union to inflict most horrific austerity on Greece. The Greek working class voted for Syriza because Syriza promised them that they could vote on leaving the European Union and rejecting the terms of this austerity, and that they could have sovereignty and not be brought into essentially becoming a kind of semi-vassal of the EU. And what happened? They elected a Syriza government. Syriza carried out a plebiscite. There was a referendum on EU membership, or no, not EU membership. It was on the terms of the
bailout.
The bailout, that was it. Thank you. It was the terms of the bailout. The people voted to reject it. Syriza buckled and accepted it anyway. So every time we see the same pattern. Now, when it comes to Britain, we saw the Corbyn project already, right? All the fake left in Britain who call themselves socialist and communist have been telling us ever since 1945, and really they have been part of a quite criminal conspiracy to lull the working class into a false sense of security about what they had won after World War II, and to undermine their class consciousness and take away their revolutionary spirit and tell them, oh, look at all the things we've got. Now, all we have to do is keep voting Labour and putting pressure on Labour to have left-wing policies and a left-wing leader and some pressure from the streets, and we will just, step by step, we will find this road to socialism that doesn't require revolution and can be delivered through the British Parliament, of all institutions, the British bourgeois parliament. They've been telling working people since 1945 is the vehicle for delivering socialism in Britain. Patently not the case. Patently, they've thrown away any understanding they once had of Lenin and Leninism and socialist analysis generally. But in the process of doing that, their maximum program of all these organizations, and why it is that despite having apparently different philosophies, they all work so well together, is because underneath all of their apparent differences, they had one real program, which was keep voting Labour and put pressure for a left-wing leader. And a left-wing leader of the Labour Party was like the Holy Grail. And it was never going to happen. And then suddenly it did happen. And there they had their left-wing leader of the Labour Party. Their maximum program basically came to effect. And what did we see? Well, our party has written a very useful analysis of what we learned in the Corbyn project. But having learned that, I think it's criminal to try to keep workers busy, repeating the exercise only, in a slightly different organizational form. It's the exact same thing all over again, even if they weren't just trying to make another party of social democracy that says to you, we will fix things through elections, which you can't do. So they're already lying to the working class, but standing up, rolling everybody up behind Jeremy Corbyn, who already showed himself absolutely incapable of standing up in the face of ruling class propaganda, in the face of their political and economic attacks. We saw what Jeremy Corbyn did. One thing that especially the Palestine Solidarity and anti-Zionist movement must take full account of is the role that was played by Jeremy Corbyn's leadership in facilitating the Zionist pogroms of Labour Party members. It was while Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party that the most vicious purge of pro-Palestinian members of the Labour Party was conducted, and even to the extent of high leadership figures and prominent MPs and politicians who were pro-Palestine were kicked out of the party as so-called anti-Semites,
including himself, right?
Well, he was branded as an anti-Semite. He wasn't kicked out of the party, but instead of standing up and saying, this is nonsense, and these charges are politically motivated, and anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, he said, sorry. He let all the people close to him be kicked out. He let a whole load of his members who were loyal to him be kicked out. And he facilitated the introduction or the acceptance by the Labour Party of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which basically says that, so IHRA, for people who don't know, that's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. It's a Zionist organization. And they made a definition of anti-Semitism, which they were been aggressively pushing through governments and state institutions across the West. And it's a complete lie. What it says is, not anti-Semitism is hatred for Jews just because they're Jews. They said, basically, they conflated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. They said, oh, if you attack Israel, you're an anti-Semite, right? So they essentially made Palestine Solidarity anti-Semitic. And the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn accepted this definition of anti-Semitism, which then facilitated the government's rollout of that, or the state's rollout of that across all bourgeois political parties. and a whole load of state institutions, hospitals and councils and schools and universities were then all adopting it. And Jeremy Corbyn played a crucial role in that process. And we are now seeing the results of it, because we now have laws whereby, my own party members have been arrested and charged under hate crime legislation for selling a book about Zionism, and being told, no, you're conflating, that's hate speech, you can't do that. And this is all part of a process that Jeremy Corbyn, I'm afraid, was deeply, deeply complicit in facilitating this atmosphere that we currently have to work in.
Do you mean his ineffectiveness is his complicity? Or do you mean
he wasn't just ineffective, he accepted the IHRA definition. He didn't just kind of flounder around, he accepted it. And that allowed it to be accepted in a whole load of other places. So on so many points of important principle, he just, buckled under pressure and reversed and U-turned. One of the reasons, in fact, what's interesting, I think, about the Your Party thing, there's a lot of labor aristocrats, trade union types, Trotskyites, who are running around acting like it's the second coming of the Messiah and wanting it to be this massive big deal. But the mass of poor workers in Britain turned their backs on Jeremy Corbyn a long time ago and don't really have any interest in this party. And one of the main reasons for that was his U-turn on Brexit. After the Brexit referendum, he initially said the vote should be respected and we should work just to get a decent deal for the working class as we're leaving. And then, under pressure from the ruling class and their agents inside his party, he basically buckled. And at the 2019 election, he was going in with this most ridiculous kind of platform of we're going to have, what was it? We're going to have a second referendum, and we're going to recommend people that they should vote against leaving the EU, essentially. And for the working people who voted for Brexit and had spent 3.5 years watching what was essentially a parliamentary sit-in, where the entire parliament was united in trying to work out how not to do Brexit. And that's all they did, literally, for 3.5 years. They just argued over the details of different ways of doing the least possible to implement the Brexit, or to either completely overturn it or to pretend you're implementing it, but in the least effective way possible, in a not really Brexit. And, that was why Boris Johnson got elected in 2019, because he just came to the election with the one slogan, get Brexit done. But Jeremy Corbyn basically sabotaged his chances of winning that election by turning against the majority of British people who had voted for Brexit, and were so angry to see how their decision was being completely ignored.
There has been a great debate going on in the United States about this, the Democratic Party or a third party or no party, right? I, as you spoke, I had similar sense of, trigger responses. In some ways, I would say that there would be a section of the left who would say that I completely agree with what Joti just said. I would accept all of those things. But I would say that don't spend time in electoral politics, parliamentary politics. But once in a 4-year or whatever, if there is a moment and your party has a chance to win, go vote for your party. That should not be your focus, but go there. Because after all, your critique could say that if you would not support them during parliamentary processes, or in France, for instance, if you are not supporting Jean Mélenchon's LFI, or in Germany, if you're not voting for, maybe they have a range of options, let's say Die Linke or Sarah Wagenknecht, and I don't know what's your take on Pedro Sanchez's Socialist Workers' Party. But effectively, what I'm saying is, to put it very provocatively, if you are not voting for the biggest alternative, what would Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist, a very, very small party, and I'm being deliberately provocative here with all respect, what would you do by yourself?
Well, we're not going to do anything, are we? It's the working class that's going to do something. And the idea that, if you're not involved in the election, you're irrelevant, that's also, that's basically repeating all the mythos of bourgeois parliamentarism that says this is our democracy and this is how you change things. But there's certain facts that, all the left need to get their head around, just like the working class needs to get its head around, which is ever since the working class was given the vote, mass of the working class in Britain, which was really post-World War I, there has been a shift of decision-making out of Parliament. So if you actually look at Parliament, you could fill Parliament with 600 Karl Marxes. Would they be in charge of the reins of power in Britain? The answer is no, right? So from my perspective, I would find it useful to engage in elections at such a point where, number one, there was actually a demand by the working class for communist candidates. Well, right now there isn't that demand. So we have to, we got to build that. There's no point standing as a communist, but if there was a real demand for communist candidates, the job of the communist candidate is to help to open people's eyes to the futility of this whole process. Because you're electing us here, but we have no power, and showing how the mechanisms, showing how all the power is being exercised elsewhere, and how the process of all of these parliamentarians being bribed by various lobby groups and under the control of various, wings of the working class, how the procedures are manipulated, and how the circus is, to almost like in the Wizard of Oz, pull the curtain back on the circus and show the working. So the job of a communist is to expose bourgeois parliamentarism and hasten the day when the mass of the workers turn away from it altogether. It's not to go to the workers and say, oh, all of those parties are awful, but our party is going to do it better. Do what better? Run British imperialism better. That's what you're auditioning for. Please, can I be allowed to run British imperialism better than the last lot? The idea that you are going to stop British imperialism being British imperialism through the British imperialist bourgeois parliament, that is a myth that has to be broken. And yes, you're right, we're very, very small, but people are learning that through their life experience. And so when we tell them the truth lands with them. Now, if we start telling them lies just to get votes, or, we start jumping on board with all kinds of projects. I've been involved in electoral projects. It's not like I've, got this absolute, must never ever do anything electoral, but I was always there with the aim of trying to connect my message with working people. So sometimes you can take part in an electoral process simply because it's an opportunity to meet people at a time when they're prepared to talk to you. We've been through peaceful periods where working people didn't really want to talk politics to you. And it was almost, they would only recognize your right to talk politics to them at an election time. I actually think that time is past now. There is so much crisis, and there are so many problems working people are facing on a daily basis that actually, if you just take a stall into the street and talk to people who pass by you, they're ready to talk politics. You can knock on people's doors. They've got a lot to say for themselves. What they're lacking is a sense that there are organizations that really speak for them. The reason that the right is able to pick up so many disenfranchised, poor working people is that they are pushing a very plausible narrative for the reason for the decline and decay of British society and British standard of living. They are basically got a 1-point program which says it's the immigrants. And that message is amplified by the entire bourgeois press, the entire bourgeois machinery. Every single bourgeois party says, yes, immigration is a problem. And then they argue, about the fine details of how you fix the problem. But because it's endorsed from left to right, and across the entire spectrum of the bourgeois media, it's a very easy sell. And the voices of the far right, so-called, are also massively amplified in our media. They are platformed everywhere. And that is precisely because they are serving the ruling class in catching disenfranchised workers and trying to herd them back into believing there's a way to fix the system and believing that their problems will be solved if just, all the immigrants were kicked out, which of course is nonsense. But the people who could actually tell them something different are like my party. Why is my party so small? It's because the bourgeois media world pretends we don't exist. And they're very effective in silencing the voice and the analysis that we have to put forward. But to the extent we're able to, we absolutely need to get it out to people that they are being misled. And the people who are posing as their friends are not their friends. The people are actually serving the class enemy. The people who spread these anti-immigrant rhetoric in their midst are inciting them against other workers. And the whole function of putting workers against workers is so the people who are getting rich off the back of all of you can stay in power and keep exploiting you all and keep you misdirected, keep you confused, and pointing your anger in the wrong direction.
Fair enough. So you would probably say that you would campaign against, or maybe not campaign against, but you would make a point against, let's say, your party.
Yes, I don't think they're offering anything to anybody that's anywhere useful. I think they are offering delusion. And more than that, actually, at this moment in time, I find it, honestly, Jyotish, I find it kind of criminal to be trying to bring people back to the idea that bourgeois politics will deliver from them when they're waking up to the fact that it won't. And on top of that, when you look at all of the deep and urgent crises facing working people right now, which are urgent and which urgently need attention, whether it's the genocide that needs urgent attention to do something, or the housing crisis, or the hunger crisis, or the employment crisis, or all the problems that are facing working people that need an urgent response, that need us to work out how to organize ourselves, use our collective power, get rid of the leaderships who are tying us to the imperialist system, and actually use our mass organization so that we as a class can exercise our power and start to fight for ourselves. Now, this is urgent. What are they saying to people? Sign up to our mailing list, come along to some meetings, and we'll get organized for the general election in 2029. It's actually a criminal endeavor in A, sowing false hope, and B, in keeping people busy doing nothing while the ruling class carries on with its policy of driving into World War III, committing genocides, and Palestine is not the only one. Ask the Yemenis, ask the Syrians, right? Ask the Lebanese, ask the Congolese, committing all these genocides right now in our faces, and pushing down ever harder on the conditions of workers at home, and repressing all of those who try to stand up and stop any of that. All of this requires the working class to urgently organize itself in its own interest, to stop all of this in its track and start fighting for itself. The idea that a kind of wishy-washy, wouldn't it, where everybody comes together and does their little wish list of how they would like the world to be, and sits in a room and talks about it, how we can build a parliamentary organization in time for 2029. It's actually a criminal diversion of people's real desire to fix the problems that they see.
I prepared one final question. I want to be respectful about your time, so feel free to answer it as concisely as you might like to. You have something to say about identity politics. I'm just picking this up, given particularly in the West, we're seeing two kind of extremities. There is a far right mobilization that would not accept any kind of agenda about non-discrimination based on gender, sex, race, etc., etc., and they have moved to a position where even being racist is being, protecting your culture or whatnot. And then on the other hand, we have the identity politics, which hasn't been helpful, to put it very mildly, or one would say it has been a completely ruling class ideology. I don't have a very strong horse in that, given I live in India, where these are not the most important questions, but our platform is a global platform, and we have a lot of viewers from the global north as well. And when I was reading your party manifesto, there was something about identity politics. So if you could just end this conversation by sharing your thoughts on identity politics and how the left should look at the whole idea of identity politics.
Sure. Well, I actually wrote a short book on this called Identity Politics or Class Politics, because you're right, identity politics is something that's been particularly heavily pushed through academia, but has now, basically, as you said, it's a bourgeois ideology which comes from without, which is a kind of, they've taken themes from this or demands from the socialist program and completely warped them and inverted them so that they stop being what they used to be and become something that is undermining the coherence and cohesion of the socialist working class movement. So they've been absolutely toxic for the working class. But of course, the reaction to fake anti-racism is not, oh, well, then racism's okay. And this is, again, we have the newest kind of iteration of all of this is the culture wars framing of everything, where actually both sides are ruling class ideologies. And we are being asked to pick one side or another, and both sides are being curated by and are being headed up by members of or sections of the ruling class. So we have to not fall into these traps either, right? When it comes to, for example, bourgeois feminism, is not really about the liberation of the mass of women from their conditions as second-class citizens with extra burdens on them that class society imposes. Bourgeois feminism is the demand that a certain strata of women in society should have equal access to the top jobs and, you know, property rights and all the rest of it. But that doesn't impact the lives of the massive working class women who still remain in the same position they've always been. So for us as socialists, we recognize that the women's question, fundamentally, it's a class question. The root of women's oppression is in class society, and it's only going to be reversed by overcoming class society, replacing class society with a socialist society. So that's why the women's question was always a socialist question. It's the same with the question of racism. Racism is fundamental to imperialism. Imperialism needs racism. It needs the racist ideologies to justify its colonization abroad, its wars abroad. It needs to be able to present the peoples who are victims of its aggression as somehow not really humans at all. They're somehow deserving of their fate or unable to develop in a civilized way by themselves. They need our helpful intervention, to develop in the world. But also that racism is needed at home to divide society, and we have to divide workers against workers. It's a very primary tool of the capitalist class. Marx and Engels identified this amongst the British population in the times of Irish mass migration into Britain. So the same time as they were starving the Irish in the years of the famine, huge numbers of Irish immigrants were coming to Britain, or even before that, actually. But through the process of colonization and suppression of Ireland and dispossession of the peasantry of Ireland, many of them came to British industrial cities as cheap labor. They built most of Britain's infrastructure, actually. They built the canals, they built the railways. They were cheap, hyper-exploitable labor force, right? They were hyper-exploitable in Ireland, and they were hyper-exploitable on British soil. And the British ruling class used their position as a hyper-exploitable force to create tensions amongst the working class. And Marx and Engels correctly identified that this was the secret to the power or the stability of bourgeois rule in Britain, was their ability to keep the working class busy fighting itself. Right? The Irish workers hate the English workers hate the Irish workers, and they're either looking down on or despising for different reasons one another. And he talked about how the media played a really important role in that, and the whole of the cultural and state institutions systematically spreading, kind of misinformation and discriminating against the Irish for all kinds of, fake reasons, or they're like this, they're lazy, they're stupid, they're Catholics, they're slovenly, they have too many children, they have their poverty is their own fault, essentially. And we see the same patterns today. What's important to recognize about the way racism is used by imperialism is they always need it, but the target can change. You wouldn't know if you're growing up in Britain today that the Irish used to be a primary target of English racism or British racism. Today, the Irish have been essentially absorbed, and we have different targets. We've had Indians, Pakistanis as the target. We've had African Caribbeans as the target. We've had, Poles and East Europeans as the target. Today, it's mainly Islamophobia. And if you want to understand why the target changes, you mainly have to look at where are the wars being fought. Today, the Islamophobia goes hand in hand with the focus of wars in the Middle East ever since 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Look how, and that's something that, you know, comes back to what we were saying earlier. You were saying about how the fall of the Soviet Union allowed the looting of the Soviet territories was something that restabilized the system, but they also were able to loot in the rest of the world too. And of course, it was the fall of the Soviet Union that facilitated that. Okay. The Soviet Union had been a protective force for peoples all over the world to be able to have an ability to stand up against imperialist looting and to have someone at their back if they wanted it, to try to have sovereign development. And
also the labor movement against its the bourgeoisie of the global south itself, because the Soviet Union funded a lot of the trade union movements in the global south.
So there's a huge step back for the whole of humanity, actually, the fall of the Soviet Union, a very deep crisis in our movement, a big setback, but it's not the end of history, as we were told. It is a setback. But, you know, inevitably, the revolutionary tide rises again. And that's what we're living through today, even as the imperialists are sinking into a deeper crisis, and it's making their war drive inexorable, and their push for austerity is brutal and harsh at home. At the same time, we're seeing a rise in the tide of the revolutionary movement. So there is a real possibility in this period. But identity politics, to get back to your question, identity politics are another weapon the ruling class uses to divide the workers against one another. You have these, oppression hierarchies. You have this idea of anti-racism that's not that racism divides the workers. And therefore, we must get together and fight it. And we must fight the imperialist system that needs racism. And instead, you have this kind of fight for rights inside capitalism, which in itself is ultimately an oxymoron. You can't have equality within an unequal society. Capitalism is a society which is based on inequality, and which, with every day, exacerbates inequality further. So the demand for equality inside an essentially unequal system, you know, it's illusory. It's an imaginary target you're going after. You're sort of asking for equality before the law. That's the best kind of equality that the bourgeois system can give you, but you don't have equal access to the law. So it's all formal, a formalistic approach to a serious question. If you really want, you know, genuine equality of opportunity for workers and equality of treatment for workers, you have to get rid of this unequal, you know, exploitative system. And so we fight identity politics, but we will not go down the wokery route of so the identity politics kind of has bred this kind of wokery. I don't really like that word, but it's very popular. People know what you mean. So we don't, you know, these kind of fake measures to address inequality without addressing capitalism, you know, it's all nonsense. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that those demands were wrong. The demand for liberation of women, the demand for an end to racism and hyper-exploitation, these are correct demands. The point is to recognize that they can only be delivered by the socialist revolution. So that's why they're part of the socialist program. And the whole job of communist parties is to help workers recognize that and work together for that outcome, rather than, you know, getting caught up in these kind of culture wars debates where essentially you are allowing yourself to be pitted against another section of workers. And in that situation, it's only the ruling class that wins. It's like in Britain right now, you know, we've got anti-immigration protests happening outside what they call migrant hotels. Now, the migrant hotels is a horrible scam that's been set up to benefit corporate landlords, where, you know, failing hotels are allowed to fall into ruin, but their owners are paid a huge amount of money to house, and use that term very loosely because they're basically, you know, open-air prisons / slums. But migrants who come in the asylum system, but their asylum claims are not processed. And while they're not being processed, they're not allowed to work or have any life, right? So they're put in these places. It's a prison, but the door's open, right? And it's a horrific condition, and they don't have ability to travel or to integrate. They don't get English lessons. They're not allowed to work. They're not, you know, so it's a horrible situation they're put in, but then provocateurs are sent into those communities to tell them, have you seen? There's these brown men walking around here, and they're getting put up in a hotel. Now, our idea of a hotel, if you're an ordinary worker, is like it's a life of luxury, right? Of course, that's a complete misunderstanding of what these buildings really are. The provocateurs are also being paid by the state to wind people up, to spread rumors about what's happening, to say these people are looking at your women, they're looking at your children, they're doing this, they're doing that. And the whole function is to get them wound up and tell them, you know how your life is going to shit. You know how your children don't feel safe and your women don't feel safe. You know how the streets have got potholes. You know how you can't get a doctor's appointment. You know how your kids can't get into a decent school, etc., etc., etc. There's immigrants down the road, and it's this conflation of the two as if one is responsible for the other. So angry workers who feel that their lives are getting terrible are being misdirected by provocateurs to have these demonstrations outside migrant hotels. Now, the reality is they're small demonstrations, even with all the efforts being put in by the state to scapegoat immigrants and asylum seekers in particular. The demonstrations tend to be fairly small. But then what also happens is a bunch of Trotskyites will come along and mobilize a counter demonstration. And what does the counter demonstration do? It screams at the people on the demonstration. So essentially, you've got some people there who said, well, we think racism is bad. And the Trotskyites say, yes, come along and oppose racism. And how do we oppose racism? We scream at the people who've been brought there by the provocateurs on the other side and tell them what evil, awful fascists they are. You fucking scum. It's really like that, So they're just screaming. What they're not doing is going and talking to them and saying, you're being misdirected. You're being misled by people who are actually trying to use you to save the system that's created all these conditions. You're being misled. But the thing is, as far as I'm concerned, the people on both sides of these, street fights have been misdirected. And at the top of both of them, whether it's the provocateurs telling fairy tales about the asylum seekers, or whether it's the Trotskyites saying we've got to go and scream at these people to stop fascism, both of those leaderships are actually directed by the same state forces. They're provocateurs on both sides, and our job is to talk to the people they've mobilized and help them to see that. So we have equally to address the angry, poor workers who have been told that migrants are their problem, as to address the people who think that opposing racism is the most important thing we have to do, and the way to do it is to scream at people who we're told are racist. This is the poison of culture wars, the poison of identity politics, and the job of communists is to try to help people see how they're being manipulated and why.
We'll leave it there, Joti. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you.
All right.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.